Good morning.
Good morning.
Our life often goes on tracks and paths that we do not foresee. And there are times in our lives with our call to worship when we are filled with confidence and we are walking on the top of the world. And then there are times when we are racked by doubt and we find ourselves in the dark valley. Our faith is much like that trek that we take through our lives, where at times we feel the presence of God around us and we are filled with that assurance. And then there are times when we struggle, when we feel that God is distant, when either we feel in our despair and in our loss that God has forgotten us, or there are times when we simply get so caught up in everything else that we lose sight and track of God. Our faith is something that requires work. And there are times when I have seen people late in their lives, visiting them in the hospital and some of them on their deathbeds, and these people who have attended church their whole lives, who have been pillars in the church, are suddenly racked with doubt and fear. And I have seen young people, barely in their early teens, in early 20s, filled with confidence and knowledge and walking with a confidence in their faith. And vice versa. Young people doubting and old people having confidence. This is not an age thing, but we all go through the turbulent path of faith. And there are times when we feel that presence, and then there are times when we struggle. Our relationship with God is like any relationship in that it takes work. It takes effort on our part to be able to feel the presence of God in our life. Some people would prefer, they would lock themselves in a dark room, cover their ears, close their eyes, and then they say, "God, find me," and we play like hide and go seek. And we expect God to navigate everywhere and to say, "Ha! Here I am." And it's not that God doesn't do more than God share. It's just that as God has created us to be part of this creator, to be in some ways co-creators in making of the kingdom of God, it also falls to us to work on this relationship, to do what is needed to stay in communion with God. The transfiguration of Christ, it comes, like I said, every year just before Lent begins, we have the transfiguration of Christ. And I will admit, I'm a little slow sometimes. It took me a long time to realize why they would put this Sunday here. But then I realized late in life, like maybe this week, that what they are doing is they are preparing us for the journey into Lent by the sign and the presence of God. By seeing the God revealed to the disciples and to Jesus, and kind of doing that same thing, reminding us of the sign and the presence of a very, very active, very visible God in some ways. We forget that Jesus, we think of Jesus now, so long after as the risen Lord and of the miracles and of the power. We can sometimes forget the humanity of Jesus. Fully human, fully fun. I appreciate the hymn that you picked, where we are reminded again of Jesus' humanity. And think of how hard it must have been for Jesus to constantly, he obviously loved his disciples, but his disciples weren't always the easiest people to work with, and yet they were better than anyone else he had. And to constantly have that pushback from the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the priests, the scribes, the very people that should have been helping him are the ones who are pushing against him. And his frustration in trying to bring about the love and the grace of God and have the very structures that are there to amplify, push against him. Imagine how hard that be. And so there are times when Jesus goes off to pray by himself, and we have this example again and again. And we see in the coming season of Lent, as we go up into Holy Week, the burden that Jesus carries. And that it was hard. That he breaks down in the garden. He breaks down when Lazarus cries. He flips tables in his anger at the situation. We see the humanity of Jesus. And so, if we think of that, then it makes so much more sense that God, his loving Father, knows the path that Jesus has and gives him this time, this vision, this gift to say that I am with you, so that he may have that strength as he faces the hard road ahead. God blesses Jesus with his voice for all to hear, well, the three disciples, and to be in communion with Moses and Elijah. And we know from the story of Moses and Elijah that they suffered as well. Like Elijah at one point was like, that's it, I'm done, I quit. And Moses was like, why do you do this to me? They all struggled with trying to be faithful. And so Moses and Elijah talking to Jesus, giving him that support and that care. How important that must have been. So I take two things away from this. I know I'm supposed to do three because that tends to be the number, but I came up with two. Who knows, by the end I might come up with a third and we'll have a longer sermon. But the first aspect that I take from this is how important it is to be with others. We often have our personal emotions, our personal feelings. Sometimes we don't even know ourselves, what we're fully thinking, and we have this turmoil within ourselves. There are times when I'm stressed, and I'm like, why am I stressed? And I actually have to stop and sit and think, okay, where is this stress coming from? Because our emotions are bouncing around within us, and we struggle to kind of figure out what we're feeling, why we're feeling. So sometimes it seems strange to try to take that chaos and share it with another person. Because, who wants to admit to everyone else, like, I am all over the place today. Like, I woke up happy, something happened, and suddenly I'm stressed, and now I'm doubtful, and then, 10 minutes later, I'm filled with assurance, and we sound crazy. So it's easier for us just to kind of present ourselves as these cool, collected people and to wear a mask, if you will. Because the mask, it keeps us from seeming crazy. But there is a gift in sharing our craziness, in sharing our struggles. And so when Jesus goes up to the mountain, he takes Peter, James, and James's brother John. It's interesting, this just kind of came to me also, like in the Gospel of John, John is the Jesus's beloved disciple, and that's how John often is described. And John writes it as the disciple that Jesus loves. And then you get the other, and it's believed that Mark in particular, but Matthew and Luke are more influenced by Peter, and so it's Peter and James, and James's brother John. But you see the humanity in the disciples, even then, that kind of like, I'm God's beloved, and Peter and James, and that other guy John, he comes along too. But we bring all of this mess with us, this sense of wanting to compare ourselves, to feel better about ourselves. But the gift comes when we share ourselves, not in competition, not in judgment, but in our vulnerability, in our craziness, in our faith. When we talk with one another about what we think, what we believe, we need support. We are a congregation. And sometimes we support each other by sharing our deepest and our craziest thoughts, but sometimes it's just the support of coming together. It's a strange feeling to pull into the church parking lot and to see the cars here and to kind of go, because you know that there are people here who care for you. We might not always be really good at expressing it. In fact, I think that is one part of the Mennonite heritage that we have grabbed hold of, where we don't often say the things that we mean, but we do and are present for one another. And that goes a long way. And we need to be able to rely on one another, and we need to be able to take advantage of this more. I think it's been a long time since I've shared a tree planting story. So when my first year was terrible. We had a lousy contract. The weather was terrible. The black flies were as bad as they had ever been, according to one of the conservation officers. And in my group, I think of the first time planters, the like 3/4, I can't even remember now, most of them quit. There was like me and another guy left. And I planted by myself because I didn't want to plant on someone else's time. I would do, this is what I wanted to do, this was the pace I was going at, this is how I felt comfortable. And it makes sense. You try to work at your physical peak, and if someone's slowing me down, that's not good. And if I need a break and somebody else, so you want to go at your own pace to feel good about yourself. And that's what I did. And then we had this other guy come to us. His whole crew had quit. He was the only guy left from his crew, and he came to us, and he and I didn't have a lot in common. I grew up in a small town in the prairies. He grew up on the west coast of Vancouver Island, spent most of his time fishing out on a boat. We were very different in our experiences and in our upbringings. But he said to me, he said, "Do you want to plant together?" I'm like, yeah, okay. And so we start to plant together, and we aren't necessarily, we're not far off from each other. But what I realized very quickly is that I was planting way more trees when I was planting with him. And he said he was planting more trees than when he planted by himself, because we supported one another. We would keep each other going at those times when I'd kind of like just start to get lost in my thought, and he'd be like, "Hey," I'm like, "Yep." And other times when he was, kind of feeling tired, I was like, "Gotta keep going." And we planted. We were far better, and the time passed. He sang every single Beatles song that he knew. And when he didn't sing, then I would start to sing until he broke down, and then he would sing again because he did not like it when I sang. He shared all the Stephen King novels that he had read. I shared all the stories that I had read, and it was amazing what a difference it was to plant with someone. Even, I know I lost touch with him right after that, but we stared down bears together. We huddled in the cold, planted together in the constant rain, in the hunger when our cooks quit. The life is better when we walk it together. The next year I went with one of my best friends, and again, what a difference it made. To start off right away knowing there was someone you could rely on, and that person could rely on you to be there for them, and vice versa. We have this romantic image of the lone wolf, that you go it alone, and we kind of buy into that movie poster theme of one man against all or woman against all the corruption and the hatred, and you're gonna do it alone, and that's who you have to rely on. But the reality is, the vast majority of wolves are smart enough to know that it's far better in a pack than being by themselves. And they don't choose to be by themselves, it happens. And if they have a chance, they will come back to the pack. In our path towards God, in our journey of faith, I invite us to remember how important it is for us to walk together, not alone. But the second aspect that I get from the Transfiguration, and this was, I think, probably in this point, one of the clearer signs, is to have that experience and that vision of God. To see and hear God in your life, God with you. And that's what Jesus gets. Jesus has that communion with his disciples and with Elijah and Moses. And you would think, talking to Elijah and Moses, you can't get better than that. They're dead. And now they're here and they're glowing and they're talking. But the voice of God, that voice of God, that trumps everything. And that's when the disciples fall down in fear. Not when they see Elijah and Moses, two people who are long dead, talking that. They're kind of like, oh, wow, this is great. We should build tents. But the voice of God, they're on the ground. Yet, we need to seek that presence of God, to, as in the words of Jesus, not be afraid and look for God in our world, in our lives. I think sometimes people are fearful of doing that because they're scared of what happens if they don't find what they're looking for. What happens if they search for God and they see nothing? But like Jesus, we are called to go up that mountain. And that again is part of this whole thing with Jesus and with God. God doesn't come down to Jesus. Jesus does have to make his effort. He has to go up the mountain. He brings his disciples with him. Obviously, we don't know what sort of premonition he had or what the calling was, what prompted him to go up the mountain. But he had to go up there, and that is where God met him. And so what I am trying to hint at or say outright is that we at times will have to go to places to seek the presence of God. You know, be they physical places or emotional places, but it requires us to put effort into this relationship to be able to draw close to God. If we wait for God in that closed room, then we're not doing our part. I'm not saying that there isn't times when God finds us even when we're hiding in the corner, but God has called us into a relationship, and that relationship requires us to do our part. So I invite you to find the mountain and to climb it, whatever that mountain may be or how it may look, and to make that trip again and again and again. I invite you to seek the presence of God. And you will find God if you have opened your hearts and opened your eyes. It might not be the way you expect, chances are it won't be on the timeline that you expect, that there will be lots of struggle, lots of time when you are wondering why you are doing this. But I tell you that God is there. I try to avoid making definitive statements, but God is there. And God is waiting, calling, seeking you out. Kaladin grew up in church. He went to Sunday school when he was young. He had a sense his parents believed, but Kaladin's attitude towards God, when people would ask him, do you believe? His statement was always kind of like, the way he would describe his relationship with God was Vietnam. He says, I believe in God, but I also believe in Vietnam. But I've never been to Vietnam. Vietnam doesn't really have any impact on my life. I know it exists out there, but it doesn't change. If Vietnam were to disappear tomorrow, it wouldn't affect me really. So yeah, God is like Vietnam. I believe God is out there somewhere, but it doesn't really affect my life. I may have met one or two people that say they're from Vietnam. I have no way to prove this, but like I said, Vietnam and God. So whenever people would ask, this was kind of his running joke of, I believe in God and I believe in Vietnam, and both have the same impact on my life. And for a long time, he was comfortable with that. But then his life kind of took one of those turns where his longtime girlfriend left him. He was never someone who had a big circle of friends. And when she left, one of his best friends that he relied on was in a relationship, and so started to have less and less time for him. He got along well with the people at his work, but suddenly he just started to find himself alone. More and more alone. But it wasn't just being alone. It was this sense of he started to seek a purpose. Why was he doing what he was doing? Why he would get up, he'd go to work, he'd come home, go to sleep, get up, go to work, and then on the days off, he would watch, he might play, but he started to realize he was kind of sinking into depression. And one day was another evening, and he was just sitting in his room, and it was kind of late spring, early summer, and the sun was up late, and he, for whatever reason, he got up and he started to walk out onto the street. He lived in the city. He was walking down the street, and he saw an old church. And in his mind, he kind of laughed, and he said, and a Vietnam embassy. And kind of like that little kind of turn, like, yeah, it's a Vietnam embassy. And it made him smile for the first time in a long time. So he did something unexpected. He turned into the courtyard that was beside the church. And he walked in there, and he looked around, and he thought, yeah, what I expected. There was lots of cigarette butts on the floor, probably some needles if he looked for them, and other stuff in the back bushes that he wasn't even going to go and find. He just started to turn around and leave when a voice out of the darkness said, "What are you looking for?" And he froze. And he turned around and he saw there was a bench that was kind of in the shadows, and at the far end of a bench was a man. And he couldn't tell in the light, if it was a well-dressed man or a poorly dressed man. And then he peered and he said, "Who are you?" And he thought it was a weird question to ask, but it's the first thing that came to his mind. This man just scared him half to death. He goes, "Who are you?" The man says, "I'm an angel." Kaladin was like, "What?" And he took a step forward, fearfully, and he looked at the man, and then suddenly he realized, this man is not an angel. First off, the angels he didn't think shop regularly at dumpsters, and the smell coming off this man was amazing. And he kind of took a step back, and the man smiled. He goes, "Not that kind of angel. I'm a human angel." Kaladin says, "Well, what's a human angel?" He says, "Well, every once in a while, angel's a messenger. And so every once in a while, God tells me to come here, sit on this bench, and wait. And I do. Sometimes I wait a long time, but eventually one of you people show up, and you're looking for God, but you don't even know you're looking for God. So my job is simply to say, look for God." Because that's it. God tells me, and that's what I come here. And it happens about once a month. And so, you were early, actually. I'm kind of happy about this. He says, but look for God. And Kaladin says, "Look for God? What, in the church? Go to service?" He goes, No. I don't know where you're going to find God. I'm just telling you to be aware. He says, in fact, what I would say is look for the small things that slowly puts together the image of God. Look for the small kindnesses in your world. Look for, I would say, in the reflections of others, that divine being. And then Kaladin kind of smiled. He said, "Divine being like you?" The man says, "Yeah, like me. But I bet you that each day, in fact, here is my prophecy to you," he says. "The next 30 days, you will see something that sparks the image or the thought of God in your life." And Kaladin says, "Well, now you're just kind of planting it. This is like," goes, "Hey, just saying it." And Kaladin says, he kind of smiles and laughs, and he starts to walk up. And then he turns around on a whim, and he says, "So, you obviously have found God?" And the man says, "Yeah." He goes, "So where did you find God?" The man looks at him and says, "I found God in a rice field in Vietnam." And Kaladin kind of like, and then he moved away a little quicker, because that kind of freaked him out. And he started to walk, and he went home that night, and he thought, like, God in Vietnam. But, this guy was, and it was just bouncing around his head. He didn't have any sort of clear thought or idea, but because of it, he didn't sleep well. And he got up late, and he was running behind, and his coffee machine didn't work, and so he grabbed his coffee late, and he's running down to get to his bus stop, because he knows this bus is notorious for never, ever waiting 1 second past. And he realizes he's going to be late, and he's running down the sidewalk, and he sees the bus pull up, doors open, and this bus driver had a rule. 5 seconds, door closed, he's gone. And he's running, and he sees the doors closed, and the bus cuts into traffic. And then stops. And Callan is kind of running. He goes like, well, that, and the doors open. And cars start to honk because the bus is in both lanes. And Callan comes up and he looks, and the bus driver says, yeah, I saw you. I see you every day. And I figured, you know what? Might as well let you on. It allows me to cut off some cars. And I love the sound of cars honking in the morning. So come on in. Callan says, thank you. I didn't think. He goes, don't remind me. Just go sit down and have a good day. Callan sits down, and then the words of this crazy man on the bench comes to him, and he's like, no, I'm not. You see, like he planted the idea. Now I'm just, but then he got to work and he realized he was feeling better than he had felt in a long time. And he had finished his work and he was about to go off for lunch when he saw his coworker still had some stuff left, and he said, hey, do you need a hand? His coworker looked at him like, are you crazy? Like, you never. But Callan was like, the bus stop for me, so I helped him. And kind of felt like it was a good day. Went home that night, got up in the morning. Bus driver was there on time this time. Said hi to the bus driver. Bus driver said hi to him. They shared names. They talked a little bit, and he sat down and he thought, I'm now friends with what was thought to be the meanest bus driver in all the city. And he gets to work and he sees a thank you note on his desk. And the thank you note's from his coworker from the day before, saying, I was having a really bad day. I was actually just thinking I was just going to leave and not come back for the afternoon, and your help made a huge difference. Thank you. And Callan then went and sought out that coworker, and they talked, and that coworker kind of shared some of the difficulties that they were going through. And at the end of the day, Callan felt close now to the bus driver and now to this other person, and it just kept going that way. The rest of the week, this had started on Monday. By Friday, he was now sitting with two other people and their lunch when he'd always sat by himself. He was talking with people. He was helping. He was looking and seeing the world in a different way. Saturday, though, he figured, okay, the streak's coming to an end because I'm not leaving my apartment. Like, that's it. I've done this thing, and the guy's words are bouncing around in my head, but that's it. I'm just staying home, and that'll be the end of it. Except his cell phone rings. And he looks, and it's his sister. And he has not talked to his sister in 6-7 months. And he looks at it, and he goes, last time they yelled at each other and stuff, and he answers it, and she just says, hey, Callan, I was just looking at old photos, and I saw one of you and I on the beach throwing jellyfish around, and you know what? I just wanted to reach out and see how you were doing. And they talked for 45 minutes. And he hung up and he thought, okay, this is starting to get a little freaky. And for the next 30 days, because maybe he was watching, maybe the man had planted the idea, maybe it had always been this way, but for the next 30 days, he saw the world in a very different way. It was almost as if God was maneuvering the people around him to give him hope, to give him some sense of grace, to give him joy. And he would confess after that it was not just those 30 days. And he realized that when he would watch for the presence of God, it was a lot easier to notice the divine in his life than when he had paid no attention at all. Many times it is those small steps that we take that help us to see God around us. There are times in our lives when we have kind of an aha moment. And the time I skated on the canal where it felt like God had lit up the world around me. But more often than not, it is in the kind gestures of the people around me. It is in thoughtful comments. It's in silent meditation. It's in a line from Scripture. But I start to see God all around me. And what a difference it makes. This Wednesday is pretty remarkable. Because this Wednesday is the beginning of Ramadan. It's the beginning, it's the Tibetan, or I think also the Chinese New Year. It's the fire horse this year. And it's the beginning of Lent. And these things are coming together kind of on this day as a day to begin. They're laughing because it's also my 60th birthday. So it's kind of like, whew. It's hard for me to ignore all those things coming. But for me, I see it as an invitation. Lent, I've often struggled with Lent. It's this time of year. March is probably my least favorite month. Lent is that whole kind of like you take things. But I'm actually thinking that this is an opportunity for me to pay extra attention. We're supposed to pay attention every day, but sometimes it is nice to have something marked, like a birthday or an anniversary or something where we pay more attention to something. Lent is a time for us to pay more attention to our faith. So this Wednesday, I invite you to think of something that you will do for the time of Lent. Some people say, well, Lent's not in the Bible. It's not. It's simply a tool that we can use if we wish. But they did it in the early church before baptism. That someone for the 40 days before their baptism, and then the rest of the church started to say, you know what? If they're doing it, why don't we do it as well, to pay extra attention to our faith? So this Lent, I invite you to think of something that you will do that makes you more aware of God's presence. Not as some sort of burden that you have to take upon and beat yourself up with, but an opportunity, a gift to be able to draw closer to our God as we prepare for the Holy Week.